I have no doubt that I often happen to speak of things that are better treated by the masters of the craft, and more truthfully, this is purely the essay of my natural faculties, and not at all of the acquired ones. And whoever shall catch me in ignorance will do nothing against me, for I should hardly be answerable for my ideas to other, I who am not answerable for them to myself, or satisfied with them. Whoever is in search of knowledge, let him fish for it where it dwells. There is nothing I profess less. These are my fancies, by which I try to give knowledge not of things, but of myself. Things will perhaps be known to me some day, or have been once, according as fortune may have brought me to the places where they were made clear, but I no longer remember them. And if I am a man of some reading, I am a man of no retentiveness. Thus I guarantee no certainty, unless it be to make known to what point at this moment extends the knowledge that I have of myself. Let attention be paid not to the matter, but to the shape I give it. Let people see in what I borrow whether I have known how to choose what would enhance my theme. For I make others say what I cannot say so well, now through the weakness of my language, now through the weakness of my understanding. I do not count my borrowings, I weight them. And if I had wanted to have them valued by their number, I should have loaded myself with twice as many. They are all, or very nearly all, from such famous and ancient names that they seem to identify themselves enough without me, and the reasonings and inventions that I transplant into my soil and confound with my own. I have sometimes deliberately not indicated the author in order to hold in check the temerity of those hasty condemnations that are tossed at all sorts of writings, notably recent writings of men still living, and in the vulgar tongue, which invites everyone to talk about them and seems to convict the conception and design of being likewise vulgar. I want them to give Plutarch a fillip on my nose and get burned insulting Seneca and me. I have to hide my weakness under these great authorities. I will love anyone that can plume me, I mean by clearness of judgment and by the sole distinction of the force and beauty of the remarks. For I who, for lack of memory, fall short at every turn in picking them out by knowledge of their origin, can very well realize by measuring my capacity that my soil is not at all capable of producing certain two rich flowers that I find sown there, and that all the fruits of my own growing could not match them. For this I am obliged to be responsible. If I get myself tangled up, if there is vanity and faultiness in my reasonings that I do not perceive, or that I am not capable of perceiving when pointed out to me, for faults often escape our eyes, but infirmity of judgment consists in not being able to perceive them when another reveals them to us. Knowledge and truth can lodge in us without judgment, and judgment also without them. Indeed, the recognition of ignorance is one of the fairest and surest testimonies of judgment that I find. I have no other marshal but fortune to arrange my bits as my fancies present themselves. I pile them up, now they come pressing in a crowd, now dragging single file. I want people to see my natural and ordinary pace, however off the track it is. I let myself go as I am. Besides, these are not matters of which we are forbidden to be ignorant and to speak casually at random. I should certainly like to have a more perfect knowledge of things, but I do not want to buy it as dear as it costs. My intention is to pass pleasantly, and not laboriously, what life I have left. there is nothing for which I want to rack my brain, not even knowledge, however great its value. I seek in books only to give myself pleasure by honest amusement, or if I study, I seek only the learning that treats of the knowledge of myself and instructs me in how to die well and live well. This is the goal toward which my sweating horse should strain. If I encounter difficulties in reading, I do not gnaw my nails over them. I leave them there after making one or two attacks on them. If I planted myself in them, I would lose both myself and time, for I have an impulsive mind. What I do not see yet, the first attack I see less by persisting. I do nothing without gaiety. Continuation and too strong contention dazes, depresses, and wearies my judgment. My sight becomes confused and dispersed. I have to withdraw it and apply it again by starts, just as in order to judge the luster of a scarlet fabric, they tell us to pass our eyes over it several times, catching it in various quickly renewed and repeated glimpses. If this book wearies me, I take up another, and I apply myself to it only at the moments when the boredom of doing nothing begins to grip me. I do not take much to modern books because the ancient ones seem to me fuller and stronger. Not to those in Greek because my judgment cannot do his work with a childish and apprentice understanding. Among the books that are simply entertaining, I find of the moderns the Decameron of Boccaccio, Aurelius, and the Kisses of Johannes Secundus, if they may be placed under this heading, worth reading for amusement. As for the Amadisies and writings of that sort, they did not have the authority to detain even my childhood. I will also say this, whether boldly or rashly, that this heavy old soul of mine no longer lets itself be tickled, not merely by Ariosto, but even by the good Ovid. His faculty and inventions, which once enchanted me, hardly entertain me at all now. I speak my mind freely on all things, even on those which perhaps exceed my capacity, and which I by no means hold to be within my jurisdiction. And so the opinion I give of them is to declare the measure of my sight, not the measure of things. When I feel a distaste for Plato's Axiochas as a work without power, considering such an author, my judgment does not trust itself. It is not so stupid as to oppose itself to the authority of so many other famous ancient judgments, which it considers its tutors and masters, and with which it is rather content to err. It blames and condemns itself either for stopping at the outer bark, not being able to penetrate to the heart, or for looking at the thing by some false light. It is content with simply securing itself from confusion and disorder. As for its weakness, it readily recognizes and admits it. It thinks it gives a correct interpretation to the appearances that its conception presents to it, but these are weak and imperfect. Most of Aesop's fables have many meanings and interpretations. Those who take them allegorically choose some aspect that squares with the fable. But for the most part, this is only the first and superficial aspect. There are others more living, more essential, and internal, to which they have not known how to penetrate. This is how I read them. But to pursue my path, it has always seemed to me that in poetry, Virgil, Lucretius, Catullus, and Horace hold the first rank by very far, and especially Virgil in his Georgics, which I consider the most accomplished work in poetry. In comparison with it, one can easily recognize that there are passages in the Aeneid which the author would have brushed up still a little more if he had had the chance. And the fifth book of the Aeneid seems to me the most perfect. I also love Lucan and enjoy his company. not so much for his style as for the good Terence, the very refinement and charm of the Latin language. I find him admirable at representing to life the movements of the soul and the state of our characters. At every moment, our actions throw me back to him. I cannot read him so often as not to find in him some new beauty and grace. Those who lived near Virgil's time used to complain that some compared Lucretius to him. I am of the opinion that that is in truth an unequal comparison, but I have much to do to confirm myself in this belief when I find myself fixed on one of the beautiful passages in Lucretius. If they were stung by this comparison, what would they say of the barbarous brutishness and stupidity of those who nowadays compare Ariosto to him? And what would Ariosto himself say? O foolish and dull-witted age, Catullus. I think the ancients had still more reason to complain of those who compared Plautus to Terence. The latter savors much more of the gentleman than of those who compared Lucretius to Virgil. It does much for the esteem and preference of Terence that the father of Roman eloquence has him, and him alone of his class, so often in his mouth, and also the verdict that the first judge among the Roman poets gives of his fellow. It has often struck my mind how in our time those who set themselves to write comedies, like the Italians who are rather happy at it, use 3 or 4 plots from Terence or Plautus to make one of their own. They pile up in a single comedy 5 or 6 stories from Boccaccio. What makes them so load themselves with material is the distrust they have of being able to sustain themselves by their own graces. They have to find a body to lean on, and not having enough of their own to detain us, they want the story to amuse us. It is quite the contrary with my author. The perfections and beauties of his style of expression make us lose our appetite for his subject. His distinction and elegance hold us throughout. He is everywhere so delightful, clear, flowing, and most like a crystal stream, and so fills our soul with his charms that we forget those of his plot. This same consideration draws me on further. I observe that the good ancient poets avoided the affectation and the quest not only of the fantastic Spanish and Petrarchian flights, but even of the milder and more restrained conceits that are the adornment of all the poetic works of the succeeding centuries. Yet there is no good judge who misses them in those ancients, and who does not admire incomparably more the even polish and that perpetual sweetness and flowering beauty of Catullus's epigrams than all the stings with which Martial sharpens the tales of his. This is for the same reason that I was stating just now, as Martial says of himself. He had less need for the labor of wit, since his subject matter took the place of wit. The former, without getting excited, without goading themselves, make themselves sufficiently felt. They have matter enough for laughter everywhere. They don't have to tickle themselves. The latter need outside help. The less wit they have, the more body they need. They mount on horseback because they are not strong enough on their legs. Just as at our balls these men of low condition who keep dancing schools, not being able to imitate the bearing and fitness of our nobility, seek to recommend themselves by perilous leaps and other strange mountebank antics, and the ladies can more cheaply show off their carriage in the dances where there are various contortions and twistings of the body than in certain other formal dances where they need only walk with a natural step and display natural bearing and their ordinary grace. As I have also seen excellent clowns in their ordinary dress and usual face give us all the pleasure that can be derived derive from their art, while the apprentices and those who are not so highly skilled need to flower their faces, dress up, and counterfeit wild movements and grimaces in order to make us laugh. This idea of mine is easier to recognize in the comparison of the Aeneid and the Orlando Furioso than anywhere else. We see the former on outspread wings in lofty and sustained flight, always pursuing his point, the latter fluttering and hopping from tail to tail as from branch to branch, not trusting his wings except for a very short hop, alighting at every turn for fear his breath and strength should fail. He tries his wings in short excursions. These, then, in this short sort of subject, are the authors I like best. As for my other reading, which mingles a little more profit with the pleasure, and by which I learn to arrange my humors and my ways, the books that serve me for this are Plutarch, since he exists in French, and Seneca. They both have this notable advantage for my humor, that the knowledge I seek is there treated in detached pieces that do not demand the obligation of long labor, of which I am incapable. Such are the moral essays of Plutarch and the epistles of Seneca, which are the finest part of his writings and the most profitable. I need no great enterprise to get at them, and I leave them whenever I like, for they have no continuity from one to the other. These authors agree in most of the opinions that are useful and true, and so were their fortunes similar. They were born at about the same time, each tutored a Roman emperor, both came from foreign countries, both were rich and powerful. Their teaching is the cream of philosophy, and presented in simple and pertinent fashion. Plutarch is more uniform and constant, Seneca more undulating and diverse. The latter labors, strains, and tenses himself to arm virtue against weakness, fear, and vicious appetites. The other seems not to esteem their powers so much, and to disdain to hurry his step or stand on guard for them. Plutarch's opinions are Platonic, mild, and accommodated to civil society. The others are Stoic and Epicurean, more remote from common use, but in my opinion more suitable for private life and more sturdy. In Seneca it seems that he concedes a little to the tyranny of the emperors of his time, for I hold it for certain that it is by a forced judgment that he condemns the cause of those high-minded murderers of Caesar. Plutarch is free throughout. Seneca is full of witty points and sallies. Plutarch of things. The former heats you and moves you more, the latter contents you more and pays you better. He guides us, the other pushes us. As for Cicero, the works of his that can best serve my purpose are those that treat of philosophy, especially moral. But to confess the truth boldly, for once you have crossed over the barriers of impudence, there is no more curb. His way of writing, and every other similar way, seems to me boring, for his prefaces, definitions, partitions, etymologies consume the greater part of his work. What life and marrow there is smothered by his long-winded preparations. If I have spent an hour in reading him, which is a lot for me, and I remember what juice and substance I have derived, most of the time I find nothing but wind, for he has not yet come to the arguments that serve his purpose and the reasons that properly touch on the crux, which I am looking for. For me, you ask only to become wiser, not more learned or eloquent. These logical and Aristotelian arrangements are not to the point. I want a man to begin with the conclusion. I understand well enough what death and pleasure are. Let him not waste his time anatomizing them. I look for good solid reasons from the start which will instruct me in how to sustain their attack. Neither grammatical subtleties nor an ingenious contexture of words and argumentations are any use for that. I want reasonings that drive their first attack into the stronghold of the doubt. His languish around the pot. They are good for the school, for the bar, and for the sermon, where we have leisure to nap and are still in time a quarter of an hour later to pick up the thread of the discourse. It is necessary to speak thus to judges whom we want to win over rightly or wrongly, to children and to the common herd, to whom we have to say everything to see what will carry. I do not want a man to use his strength, making me attentive, and to shout at me 50 times, Oios, or Oios, in the manner of our heralds. The Romans used to say in their religion, Hoc ahe, as we say in ours, Sursum corda. Hoc ahe, give heed, or always, now listen. Sursum corda, lift up your hearts. These are so many words lost on me. I come fully prepared from my house. I need no allurement or sauce. I can perfectly well eat my meat quite raw, and instead of whetting my appetite by these preparations and preliminaries, they pall and weary it. Will the license of the times excuse my sacrilegious audacity in considering that even Plato's dialogues drag and stifle his substance too much, and in lamenting the time put into these long, vain, preliminary interlocutions by a man who had so many better things to say? My ignorance will excuse me better in that I have no perception of the beauty of his language. In general, I ask for books that make use of learning, not those that build it up. The first two, and Pliny, and their like, have no hoc ahe. They want to have to do with men who themselves have told themselves this, or if they have one, it is a substantial hoc ahe that has a body of its own. I also like to read the letters to Atticus of Cicero's, not only because they contain a very ample education in the history and affairs of his time, but much more because in them I discover his personal humors. For I have a singular curiosity, as I have said elsewhere, to know the soul and the natural judgments of my authors. We must indeed judge their capacity, but not their character, nor themselves by that display of their writings that they expose on the stage of the world. I have regretted 1,000 times that we have lost the book that Brutus had written on virtue, for it is a fine thing to learn the theory from those who well know the practice. But since the preachings are one thing and the preacher another, I am as glad to see Brutus in Plutarch as in a book of his own. I would rather choose to know truly the conversation he held in his tent with some one of his intimate friends on the eve of a battle than the speech he made the next day to his army, and what he was doing in his study and his chamber than what he was doing in the public square and in the Senate. As for Cicero, I am of the common opinion that except for learning there was not much excellence in his soul. He was a good citizen, of an affable nature, as all fat jesting men, such as he was, are apt to be, but of softness and ambitious vanity he had in truth a great deal. And moreover, I do not know how to excuse him for having considered his poetry worth being published. It is not a great imperfection to write verses badly, but it is a lack of judgment in him not to have felt how unworthy they were of the glory of his name. As for his eloquence, it is entirely beyond comparison. I believe that no man will ever equal him. The younger Cicero, who resembled his father only in name, while commanding in Asia, had several strangers at his table one day, and among others Cestius, seated at the lower end, as people often push into the open tables of the great. Cicero inquired who he was of one of his men, who told him his name. But like a man whose thoughts were elsewhere and who kept forgetting what they answered him, he asked him that again 2 or 3 more times. The servant, in order not to have the trouble of repeating the same thing so often to him, and to make him know him by some circumstance, said to him, "It is that Cestius of whom you were told that he sets no great store by your father's eloquence in comparison with his own." Cicero, suddenly stung by this, ordered them to lay hold of this poor Cestius, and had him very soundly whipped in his presence. That was a discourteous host. Even among those who, all things considered, esteemed this eloquence of his as incomparable, there were some who did not fail to note some faults in it. Thus the great Brutus, his friend, used to say that it was a broken and weak-loined eloquence, fractum et elumbum. The orators who lived near his time also reprehended in him his sedulous care for a certain long cadence at the end of his periods, and noted the words esse videtur, it would seem to be, which he uses so often. As for me, I prefer a cadence that falls shorter, cut into iambics. To be sure, he does sometimes mix up his rhythms quite roughly, but rarely. My ears have noted this passage. Ergo vero me ministio sinum esse malum quam esse sinum antiquam essum. For my part, in truth, I would rather be old less long than be old before I am old. The historians come right to my forehead. They are pleasant and easy, and at the same time, men in general, the knowledge of whom I seek appears in them more alive and entire than in any other place. The diversity and truth of his inner qualities in the mass and in detail, the variety of the ways he is put together, and the accidents that threaten him. Now those who write biographies, since they spend more time on plans than on events, more on what comes from within than on what happens without, are most suited to me. That is why, in every way, Plutarch is my man. I'm very sorry that we do not have a dozen Laertiuses, or that he is not either more receptive or more perceptive, for I consider no less curiously the fortunes and the lives of these great teachers of the world than the diversity of their doctrines and fancies. In this kind of study of history, we must leave without distinction through all sorts of authors, both old and new, both gibberish and French, in order to learn in them the things of which they variously treat. But it seems to me that Caesar singularly deserves to be studied, not only for knowledge of history, but for himself. So much perfection and excellence he has above all the others, although Sallust is one of their number. Indeed, I read this author with a little more reverence and respect than one reads human works, now considering himself by his actions and the miracle of his greatness, now the purity and inimitable polish of his language, which surpass not only all the historians, as Cicero says, but perhaps Cicero himself, with so much sincerity in his judgments when speaking of his enemies, that except for the false colors with which he tries to cover his evil cause and the filthiness of his pestilential ambition, I think the only fault that can be found in him is that he has been too sparing in speaking of himself, for so many great things cannot have been performed by him without much more of himself having gone into them than he sets down. Like historians who are either very simple or outstanding, the simple who have not the wherewithal to mix in anything of their own, and who bring to it only the care and diligence to collect all that comes to their attention and to record everything faithfully without choice or discrimination, leave our judgment intact to discern the truth. Such, for example, among others, is the good Froissart, who has gone along in his undertaking with such frank simplicity that having made a mistake, he is not at all afraid to recognize it and correct it at the spot where he has been made aware of it, and who presents to us even the diversity of the rumors that were current and the different reports that were made to him. This is the material of history, naked and unformed. Each man can make his profit of it according to his understanding. The really outstanding ones have the capacity to choose what is worth knowing. They can pick out of two reports the one that is more likely. From the nature and humors of princes, they infer their intentions and attribute appropriate words to them. They are right to assume the authority to regulate our belief by their own, but certainly this privilege belongs to very few people. Those in between, which are the commonest sort, spoil everything for us. They want to chew our morsels for us. They give themselves the right to judge and consequently to slant history to their fancy. For once the judgment leans to one side, one cannot help turning and twisting the narrative to that bias. They undertake to choose the things worth knowing, and often conceal from us a given word, a given private action that would instruct us better. They admit as incredible the things they do not understand, and perhaps also some things because they do not know how to say them in good Latin or French. Let them boldly display their eloquence and their reasonings. Let them judge all they like, but let them also leave us the wherewithal to judge after them, and not alter or arrange by their abridgments and selection anything of the substance of the matter, but pass it on to us pure and entire in all its dimensions. Most of the time, especially in these days, people are selected for this work among the common herd for the sole consideration of knowing how to speak well, as if here we were trying to learn grammar, and having been hired only for that, and having put on sale only their babble, they are right accordingly to care chiefly only about that part. Thus, with many fine words, they go and cook up a fine concoction of the rumors they pick up in the city squares. The only good histories are those that have been written by the very men who were in command in the affairs, or who were participants in the conduct of them, or who at least have had the fortune to conduct others of the same sort. Such are almost all the Greek and Roman histories. For when several eyewitnesses have written about the same subject as it happened in those days that greatness and learning usually met, if there is a mistake, it must be very slight and on a very doubtful incident. What can you expect of a doctor discussing war, or a schoolboy discussing the intentions of princes? If we want to note the scruples the Romans had in this, we need only this example. Licinius Pollio found in the histories even of Caesar some mistake into which he had fallen through not having been able to keep his eyes on every part of his army and having believed individuals who often reported to him things insufficiently verified, or else through not having been carefully enough informed by his lieutenants about what they had done in his absence. We can see by this example whether this quest of truth is delicate when we cannot trust the commander's knowledge of the battle his soldiers have fought, or the soldiers' knowledge of what happened near them, unless, in the manner of a judicial inquiry, we confront the witnesses and hear the objections about the evidence in the slightest details of each incident. Truly, the knowledge we have of our own affairs is much looser, but this has been sufficiently treated by Montaigne, and according to my way of thinking, to compensate a little for the treachery and weakness of my memory, so extreme that it has happened to me more than once to pick up again as recent and unknown to me books which I had read carefully a few years before and scribbled over with my notes. I have adopted the habit for some time now of adding at the end of each book, of those that I intend to use only once, the time I finish reading it and the judgment I have derived of it as a whole, so that this may represent to me at least the sense and general idea I had conceived of the author in reading it. I want to transcribe here some of these annotations. Here's what I put some 10 years ago in my Guicciardini. For whatever language my books speak, I write to them in my own. He is a diligent historiographer from whom, in my opinion, one can learn the truth about the affairs of his time as exactly as from any other, and indeed, in most of them he was an actor himself, and of honorable rank. There is no appearance that, through hatred, favor, or vanity, he disguised things, which is attested by the free judgment he gives of the great, and especially of those by whom he had been advanced and employed in responsibilities, like Pope Clement VII. As for the part he seems to want to make most of, which is his digressions and discourses, there are some good ones and rich with fine traits, but he is too fond of them, for by not wanting to leave anything unsaid, having a subject so full and ample and almost infinite, he becomes diffuse and smacking a bit of scholastic prattle. I have also noted this, that of so many souls and actions that he judges, so many motives and plans, he never refers a single one to virtue, religion, and conscience, as if these qualities were wholly extinct in the world, and of all actions, however fair in appearance they may be of themselves, he throws the cause back onto some vicious motive or some profit. It is impossible to imagine that among the infinite number of actions that he judges there was not a single one produced by the way of reason. No corruption can have seized men so universally that some would not escape the contagion. This makes me fear that his taste was a bit corrupted, and it may have happened that he judged others by himself. In my Felipe de Comines there is this: here you will find the language pleasant and agreeable, of a natural simplicity, the narrative pure, and the author's good faith showing through it clearly, free from vanity in speaking of himself, and of partiality or envy in speaking of others. His ideas and exhortations, accompanied more by good zeal and truth than by any exquisite capacity, and throughout authority and gravity, representing the man of good background and brought up in great affairs. On the Memoirs of Monsieur du Bellay, It is always a pleasure to see things written by people who have experienced how they should be conducted, but it cannot be denied that there is clearly revealed in these two lords a great falling off from the frankness and freedom of writing that shine forth in the ancients of their class, such as the Sire de Joinville, intimate friend of St. Louis, Begenhard, Chancellor of Charlemagne, and of more recent memory, Philippe de Comines. This is rather a plea for King Francis against the Emperor Charles V than a history. I will not believe that they have changed anything in the main facts, but as for turning the judgment of events to our advantage, often contrary to reason, and omitting everything that is ticklish in the life of their master, they make a practice of it. Witness the disgrace of Messieurs de Montmorency and de Brion, which are forgotten. Indeed, the very name of Madame d'Estampes is not to be found. One may cover up secret actions, but to be silent about what all the world knows and about things that have led to public results of such consequence is an inexcusable defect. In short, to get a complete knowledge of King Francis and the events of his time, a man should turn elsewhere. If he takes my advice, the profit one can make here is from the detailed narrative of the battles and exploits of war at which these gentlemen were present, some private words and actions of certain princes of their time, and the dealings and negotiations carried on by the Signor de Langy, in which there are plenty of things worth knowing and ideas above the ordinary.